All right, you join me on the never-ending quest to stop this thing from leaking oil. Today's target, power steering pump. Went from a little leak to a slightly more catastrophic one. So I'm gonna try and reseal what I believe to be the original power steering pump. And the reason I'm doing that instead of buying a new one is, long story short, the original power steering pump and box, which should be identical to this setup, that was on my dad's 92 Silverado, that worked pretty much flawlessly for 364-ish thousand miles. And then my dad wanted to go ahead and replace it preventatively, on our terms, before inevitably something broke with it. And since let's just call it 365,000 miles, it's got 410,000 on it right now. It's had 4 power steering pumps put in it since the original one was removed, and I think it's on power steering box number 6. I'll say 5. 5 of them were part store ones. One of them, this latest one, was from a different company. I think the company's called Redhead. Anyways, that power steering box has worked out way better. Steering's a little heavy, at least compared to the original ones, but it works flawlessly, and it has for at least 6 years now, so no complaints. But that's just the fact of the matter is, at least with my experience, you're guaranteed to have a problem with an aftermarket, or at least a parts store, power steering pump or box. So that's why I'm going through the, not really much of a hassle, to try and reseal this original power steering pump. So I already got it out, obviously. Here is the reservoir that would go on it and makes it look more normal. So it had these 2 bolts back here that bolted the reservoir to the pump. You can see this one has a bit of a shoulder on it because it sits in this recessed area, so they do only go one way. This hole here had this guy sitting like that, pushed down into the pump, and then this guy screwed down on top of it. It's pretty much all there was there, other than it had this guy held some little bracket on here, and then you have this big monstrosity that bolts the alternator to the manifold to this thing. Had to pull the pulley off of the pump, of course, but not a huge deal. What I had to get a little creative with was trying to get this thing separated. So what I ended up doing is I laid it on the ground like this, where I could kind of stand on it gently without tearing it up. And then I took a giant adjustable wrench, put it across here, and I twisted the pump around and got that O-ring broke free. So gonna get this all decently cleaned up, figure out what exactly I need to replace. The thing that I thought was interesting is it has a magnet in it. So, let's see, magnet. And it doesn't have a ton of crud on it, so that also leads me to believe that this pump is actually in decent shape and is worth trying to rebuild. So there's a snap ring in here. I used a flat blade to rotate the snap ring until the end of it was closer to this through hole, and from there I just pushed this little Phillips screwdriver in there and it popped it out. So now I can just work it all the way around to get it out. So the pump's apart, and this piece with all of the, whatever you'd call those in it, that all fell out. I had this sitting like this while I was gently tapping with a mallet on the end of the shaft. And then behind that snap ring was this guy, so there's that cover, had a spring behind it. And then to get this out, I sat this up where it was propped up so this piece wouldn't hit the ground. And then I had a socket smaller than the diameter of the shaft, a deep wall one on the top of this, and just with a mallet I just went ahead and tapped it all the way through. So that looks pretty chewed up, and I'm not sure why, because there really isn't a lot of metal that I found in this pump. So I don't know if that's just the finish that it had from day one or what the deal is. But I'm gonna get the parts cleaned up and then start putting O-rings in it and this front seal. There's a bushing to replace here, so if the bushing in there looks suspect, then I'll go ahead and replace it too. So the kit, this is the kit I'm using. Alright, I got the seal out. I just used a seal puller and then put this on the ground, stood right here, pulled on it. I don't know if this bushing has a direction and position it has to go in, but that loophole there lines up with that notch in the bushing, and I doubt that's a coincidence, so there is that for reference. Alright, I got the new seal in. I put just a little bit of black RTV around the edge of it before I put it in there, the outer edge of the seal. It probably doesn't need it, but figured it wouldn't hurt it. From there, I just went ahead and tapped it back in. If you don't have something to support it, a ancient raisins can will do the trick. From there, using these little dowel pins that came out to line everything back up. Alright, so there's a big O-ring there and there. I had a little pick that let me get them out of there. Yeah, both of them just broke immediately. They are incredibly dry. So new O-rings, putting a little bit of power steering fluid on everything. I'm going to go ahead and dump some down here in the pump before I put this side of it back in. And there is pretty much how the pump works. So it has ports placed around it. I guess actually it's more of on this piece really. But so as the vanes rotate around, they create these little pockets. So like, you know, you have that one there, that one there, that one there. And as everything rotates, the volume changes. The volume of these little areas changes. See, like that's the biggest it gets. Over there's the smallest it gets. But as it rotates, it's also uncovering and covering up ports on the sides of the pump. So it lets it suck fluid in, and then once the vanes get past it, there's nowhere for that fluid to go but into the discharge port, so then it squeezes it all out the discharge side. So pretty clever and interesting. Alright, so there's the orientation of that going back in. And there you can see the vanes down in there, so I believe this would be the discharge side, I think. So as it's rotating around, it's pushing fluid through this passage into this area, and I guess it goes through those two holes into that port. That's my guess. Alright, I got ahead of myself because I don't know what I'm doing. So I got this O-ring in. I cleaned the groove as best I could, and then I cleaned this inside lip with a wire wheel on the drill press just to get all the residue and leftover O-ring off of it. So then this can go on. These three O-rings are in place. I've been putting a little bit of oil on all of them. So once this is on, then this bolt, that doodad can all go back in place. Alright, believe it or not, I actually had some progress before going back to square one. I got the pump installed, filled it with fluid, started the car, everything seemed fine, except zero power steering. Wouldn't even try. And you know, the whole whatever, you gotta bleed it argument, I mean, none of that worked. I pulled the return line off and I couldn't get anything to come out of it. The pump was not pumping through the power steering box, but looking in through the cap, I mean, I could rev it up and back down and I could see the fluid level changing. So the pump was moving fluid, it just wasn't going where it was supposed to. So, fast forward to me taking all this apart. It's twice as fun the second time, believe it or not. Got all this apart. This was my first suspect, but as far as I could tell from diagrams I could find online, I put this together correctly, being that orientation there. So the next thing I was looking at, well, something in the pump must be jacked up. And sure enough, that's where I screwed it up. Oh, also, I forgot I had these. I think these are designed to take hoses off, but it worked pretty good for or grabbing this piece like so, pulling it out without dumping the vanes all over the place. Anyways, and the benefit of why I do these videos is also for me, because I went back and looked at the video of how I put this together, and in that video I said put the dots down, because whenever this all came falling apart in my hand, that's how I thought the orientation was, but somewhere along the lines I got it backwards. This piece has these 3 little dots on it, and those dots should go down. So if you're going to do this kind of stuff, you're going to have to be able to look at the parts and try and figure out what happened and what went wrong. And here is where I figured out I went wrong. I don't know if you're going to be able to, the camera's going to be able to see that. Oh, there it is. You see those dots? Right there. The light is right on top of all 3 of them. You got 1, 2, 3 little marks, just stained marks from where this had been riding on it. So those 3 dots had to have been on this piece. I put this piece in backwards the first time for sure. So what difference does that make, you say? Well, if we pop this on here in the correct orientation, it's going to look something like that. So if we flip it over though, now we're like that. So if you notice, kind of this oval shape went from facing this way to facing this way. So pretty much what that did is, instead of it diverting fluid through the high pressure side the way it was supposed to, it was somehow just diverting it back to the reservoir because of that. So that, I believe, is where the screw up was. So I'll get it put back together and then we will try this again. Also, another thing before I forget about it, it'd probably be easier to do here on the bench, but I did it in the car. So I couldn't get the installing tool threaded into this because of junk that had built up in the threads. So if I can find the tab. So use this tab, whatever size it is. Bam, 3/8 by 16. So I did this while it was in the car, and what I did is I took the pulley and just kind of rattled it on here by hand, just so I had something that was grabbing the shaft of the power steering pump, and that was enough to hold it. And then I just put a 3/8, 5/16, I think it's 5/16 wrench on the tap, and then I used that to walk it all around and clear the threads out. It'd be a lot easier to do it here on the bench. Again, just kind of press the pulley on there by hand just a little bit, where you can just rattle it, you can just shake it back off and clean those threads up. But it is also possible to do it in the car. Final note on these vanes. So I don't know if it matters if you put them back in the correct orientation. I'm just assuming it does. But you can tell, like, that edge is dull, and then that edge is really shiny. So I'm guessing the shiny edge was the one that was riding on the housing. So on all of them, I made sure that was the edge facing out. Don't know if it makes a difference or not. That was just how I'm putting it together. All right, got everything back together. As far as getting the pump and the reservoir seated, I just kind of sat the reservoir on top of it, when the whole thing was sitting like this in the raisin can. And then I started the bolts, and I just gave each of them about 2 turns and just worked back and forth and used the bolts to pull the pump into the reservoir. And that seemed to be pretty effortless compared to hammering around on it. Also, while I have this apart, I'm going to take the opportunity to throw a new O-ring on this high pressure line. If this line was leaking, I would go ahead and just replace it now as well, but it's currently not leaking, so I'm just going to leave it. As far as installing or removing this assembly, there's really only one way that you can get it in and out, or at least that I'm aware of. So you can kind of see exactly how it's sitting right now, where the hard line that's bolted up to the pump is way up above the whatever the flex joint in the steering column. That's pretty much the only way I've been able to get this to go in and out of there, is you have to get the pump in that orientation so that it'll fall down into the bracket, and then from there you can dork around with it and get it pulled back up where this bracket's on the manifold. Alright, so having that in backwards was the problem, because it works good now. So I'll give it a week or two, see if the leaks go away, and I'll go ahead and degrease it now just to make it easier, because it is a oily, disgusting mess under there. And then we'll see what it looks like in 2 weeks. It is not leaking oil.